this world, a man himself is nothing. And there ain't no world but this one.
You're wrong there, Top. I've seen another world. Sometimes I think it was just my imagination.
Well, and you've seen things I never will.
Terrence Malick shares certain similarities with Stanley Kubrick, especially in terms of approach, although the two are also very different in prominent ways. Similarities include the desire to stifle the identification process, that is, the identification with characters on screen. Particularly, any sense of identification with omnipotence fantasy is one of the very things we have come to expect from movie-going. The open text invites audiences' participation to interpret what they are seeing, and they have to be incorporated when concocting the meaning of the narrative. But this does not mean the films are ambiguous about their meaning, which is equivalent to saying that there is no significance to them, but that the screenplay of the film is multi-layered and has the potential to become profound, especially when the audience participates in the analysis of what they are watching. In other words, the film functions as art, helping us illuminate the human condition for ourselves, but also allowing viewer participation, so the meaning is not fixed and simple. As a result, both directors are exactly what mainstream filmmaking is not, which also leads to them being viewed as pretentious or sometimes misunderstood. The Thin Red Line has a genuine philosophical worldview. By covering the Guadalcanal battle through the thoughts of various soldiers, the film demonstrates that objective reality, that is, reality as it is in itself, and is beyond the grasp of the human condition. We all experience the same single reality, the events depicted in the film, but its meaning is different for each one of these soldiers. They are each limited to their consciousness and cannot share in others. In Arthur Schopenhauer's terms, the world they all share is only available to them through their representation of it, and this will be shaped, warped, and limited by their unique senses, views, and experiences. By listening to the inner monologue of various soldiers, we can discern that we share each of their worldviews and each of their ideologies, which compete with one another for our attention and validation of their truth content. And the film does not tell you which one is useful. It is for you to interpret. Nevertheless, it provides some insight into which philosophies are genuinely beneficial to the individuals and which are detrimental. The soldiers actively create meaning to try and make sense of the extreme circumstances surrounding them. They cannot but do otherwise, simply concluding that sensory perception is impossible. They, as all humans, cannot but theory-soak all their experiences with their worldview, ideology, and morality to understand them and make them meaningful. because of the very extreme nature of what they are constrained to endure. This process of creating meaning is problematic, as reaching an adequate understanding of and concocting an appropriate elucidation of the horror they experience is difficult. It causes in each a degree of an existential crisis. They cannot escape the obligation they have to themselves and try and make sense of what they see despite their inadequacies. The narrative encompasses the politically ambitious Lieutenant Colonel Toll, the humane Captain Staros, the cynical materialist Sergeant Welsh, the spiritual Private Witt, and Private Bell, who can only function and retain his sanity through his fantasies of his wife, along with Captain Gaff, Corporal Fife, Sergeant Storm, Sergeant Keck, Lieutenant White, Brig Gen Quintard, Captain Bosch, and Sergeant McCrone, among others. The central voice-over which opens and closes the film is Buddhist-like by Private First Class Dole. Each reacts to the events around them differently by being fearful, furious, by becoming cruel and inhumane. Either way, there is no resolution to these competing interpretations of the world and how to react to it outside of the conflict they enter into with each other, the limitations of the subjective consciousness, and, in the final analysis, the isolation this entails cannot be transcended. The film suggests that perhaps some ideologies contain less truth content than others. Private Witt's fantasy of an afterlife in heaven is uncorroborated by the film. Indeed, the comfort that this view appears to offer him in the face of the real suffering of others can at times imply a quasi-disturbed and dangerous disregard of his perspective of human suffering. This fantasy view of the perfection of the Milanese society at the beginning is revisited later and undermined, and for Private Bell, the fantasies of his wife form the foundation of his worldview. But his phantasm is enfeebled by her letter to him, expressing that she's met someone else and implores for a divorce. He's left to construct his purpose on the entirely new ground following this, an undertaking for which we are given no information regarding its success. The film implies that his fantasies enabled him to accomplish consequential deeds, suggesting that a worldview enlightened by his fantasies has its virtues until the fabrication can no longer be sustained in the face of reality. The conflicting perspectives of Staros and Toll also serve to bring practical benefits. Toll's ambition drives the men to accomplishments they would not have made under Staros' command, as he is too sympathetic for their welfare to allow them to be put in harm's way. Staros' humanity tempers Toll's simplistic, inhumane views of his troops as objects to be used rather than subjects in their own right. The central narration by Dole does not seem to bring him into conflict with anyone except himself, emphasizing that man is a part of nature and not separate from it, embracing a natural inclination to empathy and cruelty. This becomes both slightly spiritual and Buddhist-like, but also humbling and modest about the human condition and any claims to any intrinsic specialness we think we have. However, if the film implies through Dole that war is inherent in nature, then it fails to address any possibility, articulating that we can create institutions and forms of governance that limit the likelihood of war, even though we remain as imperfect as always as individuals. Welsh's materialism seems to be the singular worldview best supported by the reality we see, but even here, his apparent cynicism and selfishness, which he purports as his outlook, the desire to create an island for himself, echoes Witt's desertion to an actual island at the beginning of the film, which is not consistent with the altruism he displays by helping the man on the hill, his generosity to Witt, and even his sadness at his death. He has not lost his empathy, despite his claims to look after only himself. Welsh's ruminations show him as a humanist, as someone who finds sorrow in the limitations of human experience, and articulates the tragedy that we can experience so little of humanity. Let me lack not having met you. The aforementioned corroborates that his character is central to the theme of isolation versus human interaction. While Malick seems to subtly direct our desire for identification to various characters at various times, often with mutually contradictory ideologies, he still assigns no clear moral superiority or inferiority to the differing worldviews of the characters in the film, other than what the viewer applies to the text themselves. Instead, he forces us to realize that we are all isolated in our consciousness, but must all share the world and different interpretations about it with each other. The structure of the film implies a call for tolerance, with Malick offering potential identification with any tolerant worldviews that present a philosophy of love, compassion, and empathy, but at the same time implying that they do not accord the same ability to meet real-world problems. This dogmatic morality and intolerance are criticized by Welsh in his statement about most men. They want you dead, or part of their lie. The lack of an objective authority in the world to make this statement on his behalf so that it might hold more than subjective power is sobering, and is the challenge of the human condition when faced with questions of morality. The most moving scenes in the film echo Nick Knowles' observations about James Jones, where people who experience the horror of war lose their inauthenticity and truly authentic altruism takes over them, such as the scene of Bell breaking down after the assault on the Japanese bunker on the hill. This overwhelming focus on others' well-being threatens to break the limits of the human condition of being isolated in your consciousness, and while it cannot break out of the barriers of inescapable isolation, it offers a momentary sense of transcendence from the subjective self. One might say that the central theme of the film is that each person holds an entire internal universe that represents everything about their world, and that this has profound implications for morality. How do you approach life when you're made fully cognizant of your mortality? The film offers multiple opinions for us to share in, identify, or reject, but emphasizes the need to allow each to create their meaning in life and of life.